Yeah, maybe I can use the, does it work? Yes, okay. So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this seminar. Is it on or is it off? It's on? Okay, cool. So, I would like to welcome particularly our guest today, Professor Anja Mihr, who I have the pleasure to introduce because I was the one to blame, if you want, we said this morning already, who invited Anja. I would like to introduce her, and she holds a master degree from the University of Mannheim in Germany and a PhD from Free University Berlin. The topic of her PhD was on impact of Amnesty International on human rights in the GDR, so in the German Democratic Republic, the former communist part of Germany, from 1961 to 1989. So she started out in her early days as a researcher, doing research on Eastern Germany a lot, in conjunction with human rights questions. And so, especially on the topic of, on both topics, she has continued to work, as you will see in the presentation today. So, for some time, she also worked in a more practical way on human rights, in human rights education, as president of Amnesty International Germany for a while, as I learned this morning. And then later on, she ventured into this field of dealing with human rights violations in past dictatorial regimes, which is often called transitional justice, and connecting transitional justice to democratization. So the question, is it necessary to conduct transitional justice processes in processes of democratization? And if yes, in which stage of the transformation process should that take place, etc.? And that's also what she's going to explore today in her talk. So Anja currently she's the founder and also program director of the Center on Governance through Human Rights, which is part of the Humboldt-Viadrina governance platform in Berlin. And she has held numerous positions as a researcher and professor, both in Germany and abroad, including at the German Institute for Human Rights, at the University of Magdeburg, Humboldt University in Berlin, the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at the University of Erfurt, and then going to the European / international positions. This included the European Inter-University Center for Human Rights and Democratization, Utrecht University in the Netherlands, Beijing University, where she was at the law school. And then recently she was almost half a year as a visiting professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So quite a very interesting trajectory, and you see a lot of connections also in the institutions to these questions that she actually does research on, human rights, democratization. And you can also see that she has quite an interdisciplinary profile in between political science, comparative politics in particular on the one hand, and international law, particularly human rights law, on the other hand. And in these fields or on these topics, she has published numerous articles, book chapters, and books. And she also is editor or co-editor of 2 big edited volumes that came out in the past few years, including the Handbuch, Transitional Justice, Handbook on Transitional Justice, which was published with a German publishing house, and the Sage Handbook of Human Rights, which is a big volume of more than 1,000 pages with all kinds of information on human rights and related issues. And then very recently, a couple of months ago, her monograph with Cambridge University Press came out, which is going to be the subject of the talk today. It's a book titled Regime Consolidation and Transitional Justice, comparative study of Germany, Spain, and Turkey. So mainly it explores this connection between transitional justice and regime consolidation. And this is also well, as I said, the topic of the talk today. And I'm very happy to welcome you here, and very happy to see so many people here. And and I'm looking forward to your talk and then hopefully to a lively discussion, because I think it's a question that also kind of has some relevance for debates, recent debates in Brazil. We have had a Truth Commission here that finished its work just a few years ago, so it's still an ongoing debate on this connection between transition and democratization, transitional justice, etc. And so, I think it's going to be an interesting debate, and thank you very much for being here, and I leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Britta. Thank you for the introduction. And yes, I do think that it might has some connections to the Brazilian case. Even so, I will give examples of the European context, but you will soon find out what the purpose of this is. It's not to describe and sell or talk about the various transitional justice processes in Europe, but kind of what we can learn from it also for other countries. Nevertheless, to do a little bit of advertising, it's like the Americans do. You know, they always show the book. I've never done this before. We Europeans are a bit different. But anyway, this is the book. And as Britta was saying, the book is titled Regime Consolidation and Transitional Justice. And one of the reasons is because when I talked to the publisher about 3-4 years ago, when we first had the first negotiation, that was the working title. And at the last minute, I wanted to change it to this title, through transitional justice, regime consolidation or democracy, let's say, or even autocratic regimes through transitional justice, because that's more adequate for what it actually is. And there was no way. It's a tough publisher. They say, no, this is in the system. We can't change the title. Anyway, so you get the exclusive on the title the title of the heart, through human rights. I don't know if it stands. If not, anyway, here it is. And it's a little bit what Britta said. It's when this whole thing started, it was about 10 years ago. It came a little bit through my human rights work in various countries around the world, and then this debate that came up in social science research about the quality of democracy, because as you know, in the 1990s, we had this mushrooming of democracies, including this country, in a positive sense. You know, every day you woke up, you had a new country on the planet, and of course they were committed to democracy. You know, it's not like they wanted to go to communism or absolute monarchy or totalitarianism. No, everybody had on the plate democracy. So in the 1990s, actually, somewhere in the end of 1990s, some of the democracy scholars actually said, look, we have, 150, 60, 70, 80, now we are in 193 countries on this planet. And all these countries, except maybe for a handful nowadays, like Saudi Arabia, North Korea, etc., all of them commit to democracy. And we don't really have an overview anymore of who is really democratic and not. So these scholars started to look at how can we differentiate democracy, because obviously there is a difference between the new South African regime that converted towards democracy in the mid of 90s after abolishing the apartheid regime, and Sweden. So the quality of democracy, let's say, between South Africa and Sweden is different. Maybe between Brazil and Canada is different. You know, even so, they had constitutions that were all based on democracy. And this is when this debate about quality of democracy came up. Then the field of transitional justice emerged at the same time. And from a completely different angle. It had nothing to do with democracy studies. It was basically connected to, let's say, the transition processes, yes, in Latin America, of course, but also when then the Yugoslavia conflict, then the genocide in Rwanda, etc., and when these sort of the tribunals and trials from a more legal international human rights law angle came and said, how are we dealing with past injustice and perpetrators? So, and then, you know, you had these two sort of branches coming from the international law perspective, where they all were dealing with criminal justice and how to atone past injustice, crimes, etc. And on the other side, this kind of mushrooming of democracies, and everybody was struggling. How can we measure the difference or the quality of democracy? And so this is why it started shortly after the 2000s of the turn of the millennium, in a way. Where wasn't only me, but it was a few scholars in that field who said, well, maybe there is a correlation between the way countries atone with the past, reckon with the past injustice, regardless of what regime. It could be like at the apartheid regime in South Africa. It could be a communist regime like in East Germany or Poland or the Soviet Union. Or a fascist regime, a military dictatorship like a lot of Latin American countries. And it doesn't really matter what sort of past regimes there were. Maybe the quality of democracy, the development, the democratization process has to do with the way these countries deal with the past. And to make it short, one of my assumptions at the beginning was that the more resilient democratic institutions are towards crisis, financial crisis, whatever crisis, political crisis, could depend on how this system, the regime, learn to deal with, let's say, an unpleasant past. And I was approached at that time by a colleague, Philipp Schmitter, at that time, who's a scholar of democracy studies, of course, and he asked me one day, and he said, well, why is, Germany is fairly resilient to some of the crises. Not perfect by far, no, but it's fairly resilient. And maybe that has to do also with the way they had to deal with the past. We don't really know. So then I started to find sort of my kind of a hypothesis there. And I said, well, I'm also intrigued, and particularly coming from Europe and seeing that even within Europe, the quality of democracies are very different. And then I wanted to look into my own case of Germany, but also in East Germany for one particular reason, because here you had sort of a unique laboratory for democracy research and also transitional justice research. After World War II, you had a situation in Germany that you had a country that definitely the Nazi regime committed serious, war crimes, atrocities, genocide, so the worst of the worst that you can imagine. And then it was divided. The one turned into a communist dictatorship, and the other one, semi-liberal, kind of free democracy. So whenever I traveled and I went abroad, people told me, yes, but you're European, you're German. Of course you develop to a democracy. Well, we in Rwanda, we can't. Or we in Korea, we can't. And I said, this is a bit rubbish. I don't believe that. I don't believe just because you're Europeans, you have it's actually the opposite. And then there was this unique case for research to say there's one country in Europe that has the same past, but it was divided for whatever reason and turned into two different regimes using transitional justice measures in a similar way. And I see some question marks in the faces here. Transitional justice, maybe I should briefly explain it, actually. I've been talking about this for the last 2 days, so maybe I should not assume that everybody knows. What are these transitional justice measures that we're talking about? Well, you of course know this in your own country case here in Brazil. The Truth Commission would be one measure, but in many countries it's also considered the trials. Of course, there are the Nuremberg trials, the Tokyo trials after World War II, but they are not really relevant nowadays in the transitional justice or this kind of trials. In the transitional justice process is more what we know about the Yugoslavia Tribunal, later the Rwanda Tribunal, and now about the International Criminal Court. But severe and systematic crimes against humanity or human rights violations in a way, then there are the truth, the commissions or commissions of inquiry, reparations, compensations, memorials, amnesty laws, lustration processes. They are all called transitional justice measures, and many of them have also been applied here in the Brazilian context or in the Latin American context, and they all have been applied in the European context too. And nowadays we can say that there's actually no country on this planet who goes from one regime to another that does not apply some of these measures. It's a little bit like mushrooming with this mushrooming of democracies. On the one side, all the new countries or the reformist countries, they claim to be democratic, and at the same time, for various different reasons, they claim to conduct trials, they put truth commissions, this justice claims thing. But yet, the outcome is very different. Even often, as in the German case, we could see the same story of the past, but then yet a very different outcome in terms of regime development. And then I took another case to look at it because for those of you who are in transitional justice research or even in democratization research, there is this one case in the world that drives us all nuts. and that is Spain. Because, wherever we go now, or, if you work in the political consultancy field, I worked a lot in Colombia, and there the international community says you have to have transitional justice, otherwise you will not make it. It's like a golden rule nowadays. You have to have trials, you have to have truth commission, otherwise you will never make it with democracy. And of course, then someone brings the big elephant in the room and says, well, we have this one case in Europe, it's called Spain, where after the death of Franco in 1975, there has been absolutely no truth commission, no trials, no reparations, no memorials, except for private ones later on, etc., etc. And yet, it is a country that consolidated in democratic terms. So how do you explain this? Basically, the short form from that, it would be, all right, let's save all these expensive trials. Because one of the Rwanda tribunal or the Yugoslavia tribunals or the ICC, this is $1 million business. And if it were true that you don't need all this in order to consolidate a democracy, why should we waste money on this? Maybe use this money for something else. So that's really the nut to crack. And I will elaborate on what actually happened in Spain. And then I have Turkey as a case study. It's more a test case to apply whether transitional justice can actually make a difference in terms of quality of democracy. This is how it all came about. To already present you, to also keep you awake, because I know it's late afternoon. You all probably have low in sugar and all these things. I myself, maybe I conclude for myself, is that what I found out, and this is the exciting thing about a researcher, is that when you find out things that you did not expect. And there were two findings, actually three, let's say 2.5. First of all, what I did not expect when I started looking at it, that transitional justice measures, trials, commissions, can contribute, yes, to the quality of democracy, if you want to say, but also to the quality of dictatorships. And what I found, and now when I look at other cases, I mean, these three cases are in my book, but I've also worked in Rwanda, I worked in Korea, in Japan, I had a research grant, I worked in Chile, and we also looked at Hungary and other Eastern European countries, and we could see that the same measures that in one country contribute to, let's say, stabilizing democracy. I'm not saying this is, you put a little trials in there and then you get democracy. That's not it's not that easy. Yeah? But that they can contribute to the quality of democracy, democratic behavior, etc., performance, and the same measure in another country stabilizes a dictatorship or an autocratic regime like it does in Turkey. And I said, whoo. So actually this general assumption that if you have a trial to deal with past perpetrators, to bring your all military generals to trial and to justice, etc., automatically leads to more justice and more rule of law and more quality of democracy, is not true. So I looked the second look then, which it was surprising for me, because I went through the archives. I could read, I can read German and Spanish, and therefore I could look at the archives. My Turkish is pretty bad, but anyway, I had other sources there. But anyway, when I looked at this, and I said, all right, what is then the difference? These countries all had trials, and they all had truth commissions or commissions of inquiry, but the outcome was different. And what I could find is that the countries where actually transitional justice measures contributed, and I'm careful with words, it's not linear contribution, it's not a direct outcome, but contributed, let's say, to the quality of democracy, better performance, they conducted transitional justice in an inclusive way. Whereas countries like Turkey, I will give the example of Turkey, they used or abused almost transitional justice measures in an exclusive way. What do I mean by it? Inclusive, exclusive, I know it's a bit fashion term right now in international science, but what is meant in this context? Inclusive means that if you start, let's say, with reparations for victims of past atrocities, or with trials and truth commission, what we see now, for instance, with trials in some countries, like in Colombia, you take first one group of potential perpetrators and you try them. But you leave the back door open that you can expand the group of people that you potentially trial in the future. And this is, for instance, what happened in West Germany after World War II, that the West German government, for various reasons, it was a lot imposed from the outside, but nevertheless, I'm actually happy they did it, the Americans. Nevertheless, but there was a clear direction. You start trialing one group, or you pay compensations and reparation to a certain group of victims. But if there are other groups of victims coming up and showing evidence that they have been victimized during the Nazi regime, or nowadays during the communist regime when we have the same procedures in Germany, you give them space, you give them room. You say, yes, you're actually right. Let's include you. Let's be inclusive in also adding you to the group of victims, and therefore you get a way of compensation. That's by inclusive. Inclusive basically means open or open-end, as long as, of course, there is evidence and accountability. Exclusive, what I could find when I look particularly at the case of East Germany after World War II and in Turkey is that these countries were much more exclusive. They also had trials and commissions and memorials and reparations. But for instance, in East Germany, when you came up after World War II and I said, well, I have been a victim of the Nazi regime, can I get some compensations? Because I've been invalid, I've been to the concentration camp and, really barely survived the whole thing. The communist leadership would ask, are you a communist or not? They didn't ask what happened to you. It doesn't matter. If you were not a communist, you were not compensated. I put it now very simple. It was a bit more complicated than it, but it was a general notion. You had to be on the right side. And the same thing was in Turkey. Yes, these procedures were conducted, but they served a certain political, ideological, often purpose after 1990. I will go more into this detail. I'm just saying this is something I did not expect, that the same measures, but if you apply them more exclusive or inclusive, it has, let's say, a completely different outcome. This was my second finding. The third finding, or the half finding, was what I called the spiritual mutual way. Often people were asking me, so, what we love to see also as scientists, even as social scientists, is sort of this linear correlation. You put a little bit trials, you get a lot of democracy out. Unfortunately, the world doesn't work like this. What I could see is that there was a spiritual mutual reinforcing way. For instance, and this is what I mean with inclusiveness. Yes, you start off like in West Germany, after World War II, you had the Nuremberg trials, and then you had other domestic trials. Many of you probably have never heard of it. I'm not going too much into details. Anyway, so you tried one certain group of perpetrators, Nazi perpetrators, but not all of them. And yes, by this, you sort of build a little bit more trust into the system, et cetera, et cetera. And this led, again, to new claims, because some people saw, oh, you actually trial these guys. They actually, pleaded guilty, or they actually, whoa, I know someone else, actually. So maybe I can bring that person to court too. It's kind of, by example, people got sort of encouraged to go up. And we see this in particular in West Germany. There were some trials at the beginning of the 1950s, and then only 10, almost 12 years later, we had the first concentration camp trials on SS, on the Auschwitz trials, and then Treblinka and Malanga in the concentration camps. But not at the beginning. It was a completely different story. But the trust had to be built up. This is what I mean by mutual reinforcing. And again, this was some sort of an interesting finding that the transitional justice process, if it contributes to stabilizing and consolidating a democratic regime, it's a long-term process. It can take 10, 15, 20 years, and it's always mutually reinforcing. And I will go more into the details. So this is, in a nutshell, my findings. I hope I haven't already lost you completely. I try to put a little flesh on that. What, again, I learned a lot during doing this research, also dealing with transition and transformation studies and concepts. And those of you who are in democratization or transition studies know that there are various definitions of what is a political transition after a regime change and how long it can take. I took a more sort of liberal approach simply from the evidence that I found in the archives, but I know there is a more conservative approach what a transition versus a transformation is. What I look at here, and you see the scale, is that when I look at countries, also later when I was working in Rwanda and in Sierra Leone, I was working for some time, what we looked at is the time of the, let's say, a peace accord. It could be a ceasefire. It could be also a declared regime change, what we call then a pacted transition, or the death of a dictator like Franco in bed. Yeah, it's just there's a momentum where you change the regime, either because you pull or you put your president into exile, that would be Egypt, or the dictator dies, or you have the end of the war, etc. It doesn't really matter what caused the end of the regime. It matters later, but at that moment, and then you have a day zero in a way. This is what they call the beginning of the regime change. And change is very, very, very different from consolidation of regime. Change basically means you have a new constitution, maybe you have some sort of election, you have a new political leadership. You exchange one regime type or system with another one on paper. It doesn't mean anything yet. It means on paper you make a commitment. We saw this in the Arab Spring. There was a lot of regime change. Not all of them made it, as you know. Tunisia currently is the only one who is moving forward. So this is the beginning of transition, and here now scholars often argue how long the transition before the consolidation of a regime. And this regime is a very neutral term. It's a political regime, obviously, but it doesn't automatically have to be democratic. It can also be autocratic. And it helps us a little bit to be open to that, not assuming that a political regime automatically has to be democratic and consolidated. Dictatorships also, or new dictators on the field, our Erdogans and Putins in Europe, we have a couple of them. Well, you have one up in the north here too, in I think Venezuela. And so these people that are working with the same mechanisms of consolidation, because if you want to establish an autocratic regime, you work very hard on consolidating that one, and you use, and that is interesting, often the same means, but in a different manner, exclusive versus inclusive. Transition in this kind of the context of the countries that I looked in, I was very generous, and I said, well, what I could see is in the first 5 to 10 years, whether it's West Germany, even East Germany, Turkey, Spain, the first 10 years they were just kind of busy in confirming the change. Let's see, constitutional reforms, having sort of elections, and if they included transitional justice measures like in West Germany or in East Germany after World War II, which was usually imposed from the outside, they did not do this for moral or reasons or because of some sort of responsibility to the victims. And I think this is the biggest disillusion. And I see this, sometimes I work now in the field of consultancy, and I go to countries and I work with governments that are in early transition. And this is the most painful moment for me sometimes, when I have to tell the chief prosecutor of that particular country saying, you're very early in the transition process, and I know your heart is on the right place, but I know that currently is only time to do this for very tactical and political reasons, because the emotions are so strong in the country. The hatred, the mistrust is still there. You can change a regime on the paper the first year, but not in the minds of people. We saw this also even in Germany, in reunified Germany after 1990. This was only, it was a small East Germany. It was a small country, it was a communist regime, so it wasn't really to compare with after World War II. Nevertheless, people often could not sit on the same table with those who have maybe caused them pain by through the Stasi vigilation, and they couldn't go to university, they were put in prison, etc. So the mistrust, you cannot sit on the same table with the people that really hurt you. But for peaceful transition, we need these negotiations and we need to sit on the same table. So we saw this also in Bosnia. I once was in Bosnia and I talked to the people who were involved in the transition process, and they said, we hate each other so much you cannot imagine. I mean, we feel like getting out the knives every minute. What they did on the governmental level between the Serbs and the Bosniaks, because they had to work together to some extent. They've been living there for the last 2,000 years, so, they had to somehow come to grips. First of all, they introduced, they say, the concept of working relationship. You don't have to marry, you don't have to love each other, you just work in the same administration. And because on the very elitist level, they were even refusing of speaking the same language, Serbo-Croat. So they introduced English. Just to give you an idea if there is so much tension in the room. And yes, of course, rationally, and we know, you have to forgive and you have to trial and you have to be fair and you have to love your enemy. But in practice, in the first years, it doesn't work. It changes dramatically after 10, 15 years for obvious reason, because there's a new generation coming, etc. But I think we should not get the wrong illusion. And often this is what I find, again, so painful in some of these countries who are, particularly now in sub-Saharan Africa, when they come out of a war or a conflict, and then the international community rushes in and says, oh, now you have to have reconciliation programs immediately, 1 week after the genocide. Hold hands. Be happy. And I said, this is not fair to the people. They need, they have wounds. So let's be realistic. Tactical concessions, political, sort of rational choices, but not emotional empathy. That comes later, and it really determines whether the quality of democracy, or it determines in a way the quality of democracy or autocracy. But the first 5 to 10 years, not. In the first 5 to 10 years in the transition period, you have reforms, social security sector reforms. Usually this is more also in this part of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, we have that. It didn't really play a big role in Eastern Europe after the end of the communist regime. But there you had more the constitutional reforms, elections, vetting procedures, institutional reforms. You establish courts, because in a lot of countries you don't have a rule of law, let's say independent courts. And you can already see by the description I put here, and I found this also in my research, these are more technical approaches. Just get the institutions in place, get the constitution, because however you create the constitution in these first 5 years, and this has been a country in transition also for a long time, actually. You had several constitutional reforms at the beginning. You start off with something. However, we can see that the outcome later on, so 20, 25 years later, let's say the quality of the outcome, whatever regime, depends very much on whether in the first 5 or 10 years, in this, let's say, constitutional reforms, you have built in a way, an inclusive option. But I hope I get the message right here, because on the one side, even if you have the most open, the most progressive constitution at the beginning, but the people just hate so much each other that they will not apply to it. But at least for the future generation, there is an option to use that, to be open. And this is what we see in countries which adopt a more inclusive approach. A more inclusive approach right after a conflict or even an autocratic regime is very satisfying for those who won the battle, whether it's a real battle or a political battle. It's like, we won, and the other ones, finally they are in prison, and finally we put them all out. But they kind of closed the doors because, again, what we had in whole Eastern Europe after World War II, and particularly in East Germany, is if you were not a communist, forget it. I mean, you were just, didn't matter what you suffered, you were just on the wrong side. So the winner takes it all. Yeah? And that is not going to lead, I can tell you that, obviously, for some reason, is not leading to a very resilient democracy in the future. And then after 10, 15 years, and here you could see these patterns again in all these countries, is that this is usually the time, 10, 15 years, when you have first civil society movements, victim organizations daring to talk. And again, this depends very much how you put the recipes in the first 5 to 10 years, whether you allow for victim organizations to come out, to have public talks, media culture. And I'm sure it's, without really knowing the Brazilian case very well, I read a little bit about it, but I would not dare in this audience to say that I know it in detail. But when I sometimes go to countries and I don't know the details about it, but I'm asking them, my counterpart, I said, okay, when did you have your regime change? Where would you put it? Was it 85, 86, 87, whatever date? And then I said, let me guess. The first sort of theater plays, documentaries, movies, novels came out 10 years later, 15 years later. And the memorials came out 15, 20 years later. And they say, yeah, how do you... It's interesting. I said, well, it's a human factor in a way. We can see this in every society. What I'm trying to say here is that when they often say, well, the Europeans, of course, they did it again or so. No, it has nothing to do with that. And it doesn't have to do anything with the severity or the kind of conflict, because I noticed it again in my own country, Germany, and even after Britta was saying it, I was dealing my PhD a lot with East German and also with East German victims who had been in prison for no reason at all under communism. And when I talked to them after reunification, they said, look, this regime, they took half of my life. I was 16 years old. I had to make a funny joke about the communist leader, and I got to prison for 5 years. I mean, you're taking my youth away. Yes, I have not been under the Nazi regime in a concentration camp, but my life was ruined because of this regime that I was living in. So when you talk to the victims of the regime, for them it doesn't matter what kind of regime. They were sort of victimized, their lives were sort of, their future was destroyed. So they don't care, but they make a very big difference how you deal with them in the transition and the transformation process. That's what I learned from them. So this is basically the scale that I saw that there is a pattern, and also even with the countries like Spain, I'll give later examples. I have pictures, so I wake you up. This is just 3 slides with a little bit of theory and concept. Another thing that in terms of, let's say, the myth of transitional justice. As I say, there are these various measures on trials, truth commission. I repeat them because for those who are not so familiar with it, what did you say again? Reparations, compensations, memorials, amnesties, for instance. Vetting illustration. I think vetting illustration took a little place here in this country too, a lot in Eastern Europe, in other parts not. So there are various measures. That there's another unpleasant sort of information. I don't want to call it truth. Information that often I have to give to particular victim groups. The Balkans is a very sensitive issue in Europe. When you go there as an academic, sometimes they send you there because nobody dares to tell the victims what they actually are, or the perpetrators. So they send someone from the outside. And the job is, or my job was, for instance, in Serbia one day to tell, they say, well, according to our studies, it's just a pattern around the world. It doesn't matter whether you're in Japan or in Serbia or in Bosnia or in Chile. It seems to be the same. Is that, let's say, in the first years of transition, the transitional justice measures, trials, vetting, illustration, are very backwards looking. They are very perpetrator and victim focused. And yes, most of the work, the energy, the money goes into there. This is the big thing, the trial thing. But actually, the transitional justice is not for you guys. Because what you could say, once you compensate the victims, you acknowledge, you compensate, in an ideal scenario, you get the full-fledged groups. Or once you try the perpetrators and put them behind bars, you could say, job done, let's go home, yeah? We don't need memorials, we don't need further history commission, we don't need book, the job is done. Great, everybody happy, let's go on. And apparently that is not the case. So the most of the energy, the resources, the measures, the plethora of measures that we have in terms of transitional justice, some colleagues call it toolbox, rule of law toolbox, and all sorts of toolboxes that we have. The UN likes to talk about toolboxes here. actually is forward-looking. It's not about backwards-looking. And what I said here, it's the backwards-looking is to delegitimize the political regime. What we could see is, again, I'm talking about the quality of democracy for the future, but before you build, let's say, democracy or dictatorship, and even dictators work with that, is you have to delegitimize the previous regime, whatever the regime was. Doesn't matter. In order to establish a new one, you have to tell the people, by the way, it wasn't so good. And the best way to do it is to bring the perpetrators to justice, or to even show trials. That's what the communists did after World War II all over Eastern Europe. They had show trials, and later too in other sense, to kind of delegitimize the previous regime and put yourself in a better light. And again, there's a different way. Some do it exclusive, others inclusive. But most of the energy and the long-term run is to legitimize the new regime. And here I put a democratic regime, but you have to put this as neutrally. It could be a dictatorial regime, just a regime. You use memorials. You use even, let's say, the novels, the literature, even truth commissions, because truth commission is not a one stop. You can have various commissions of inquiry over the decades. Serve the purpose to legitimize the current regime. But in order to legitimize, I have to delegitimize the previous one. So I use the transitional justice measures to do this. Now I give you the example of Germany. I show you some pictures, so no more text, and a little bit of my, I would still say, surprising findings to some extent. Of course, I've worked so long on the topic, and I had to read this book, the manuscript, 20 times, so I feel like, oh my God, this was obvious. Why didn't you just think about this 10 years ago? But anyway, I remember when I sometimes were in archives, I was just like, wow, I had no idea this was happening. So what I will present to you the case of the two Germanys after World War II, and in terms of transitional justice, I'm kind of trying to underline the findings here, or how it came about the findings, and then Spain and Turkey. So this was the situation in Germany after 1945. There were the different sectors, but basically you just have to look at the red one. This is East Germany, and the other colors, this is West Germany. I'm not going into detail why and where and why there were various sectors. It's interesting, and this is why I show you this map. As you can see, the red part is occupied by the Soviet Union, and the western part by the Western Allies, France, UK, and the United States. There were also the Belgians, and it was a patchwork. Both sides of the Iron Curtain had the same, let's say, impositions. Because when the two Germanys were actually founded as countries, and that is very important, they weren't founded in 1945, obviously. They were occupied. They were, Germany was dangerous at that time, so nobody really wanted it to be a country, sovereign country. So it took another 3-4 years. So in 1949, both parts of Germany became semi-sovereign countries. And when you gave them sort of a letter of semi-independence, because we remained occupied, a lot of people don't know this, until 1990 actually. We said, we are only sovereign countries in 28 years. They gave them the letter, said, look, we give you some sort of sovereignty, both sides. One is the communist, the other is sort of the Western liberal democracy part. But you have to continue with the trials against the Nazi perpetrators. You have to do work on reparations, because the Nazi regime, when they occupied the rest of Europe, they, of course, stole a lot of things, and they had to go back. It was art, it was machines, it was a huge mess. Anyway, so reparations was a big issue. And then later also compensations, individual compensations. So that was the interesting part. Both had the same homework to do. The Allies said, well, you can try to be a regime, but you have to do. And they both fulfilled it. It's maybe being German, you get a homework and you do it. And, they had not much choices, because the Soviets and the Americans, they were very, very careful, and they watched you. And, have you paid enough reparations yet? Yeah, well, we told you. Now, have you trialed all? Yeah, all right. So it was for years it went on like this. And this is what is so interesting, because the one side, the East side, the communist side, they applied trials on Nazi perpetrators. They compensated. They paid reparations to the Soviet Union. They did everything right. But for instance, in East Germany, because sooner or later there were claims by Holocaust survivors from Israel or from the United States who dared to write a letter to East Germany, said, well, I was deprived of my house in 1937. Can I have a compensation? Because that was in the treaty. And the East Germans said, no, you can't. Because you're not a communist. And if you were in Israel, it was really bad for you, because Israel didn't have official diplomatic ties to East Germany. And they said, well, if your country doesn't have official ties with us, we can't compensate you. Exclusive approach. That was not the case in West Germany. But there were other difficulties, particularly when it came up to Eastern Europeans. The West Germans were not allowed to compensate Eastern European victims, because that was a deal with the Soviet Union. But what I'm trying to say is that the transitional justice, in this case, the victims were often used as tools almost in a very dirty game of Cold War. In 1952, there was the first sort of reparation agreement between Germany and Israel, West Germany and Israel, because West Germany took the responsibility for the Nazi regime, and they said, we are the successor country, we don't like it, but we have to do it. Someone has to do it, basically. And there were the first agreements. Why am I saying this? This was also novel because actually Germany had never been in war with Israel, obviously, because Israel was only founded in 1949. As you know now, they just had the 70th celebration today, I think, or yesterday. And, this was 1948 then. Yeah, right, they were earlier, right. And so, of course, if you haven't been in war with a country, or simply didn't exist, there's no way of paying reparations. But they developed international law in a new manner for this particular case because of the survivors. This was a novelty at that time. And here you can see, don't get me wrong, I'm not praising the whole thing. A lot of these measures, particularly in West Germany, they were imposed. It's not like the people, for tactical reasons. This was not for moral reasons. And it's often, it even bothers me a little bit about my fellow compatriots in Germany. Sometimes we run around the world and we say, yeah, we have done a great job. This was a lot of pressure. And why am I saying this? It's because often they say, yeah, they did everything right. It was such a democratic country. No, it was not. In the first 10 years, it's often, if you don't have international, this was pressure. This was really, Germany was an occupied country. It was not a sovereign country. But nowadays, when you go to the Balkans or to some sub-Saharan African countries who have transitional justice, they say, oh, what is the international community doing? Why are they watching it? From my experience, from what I saw, if you don't have some sort of international vigilation or incentives nowadays, at that time it was pressure, but it's not going to work. You need sort of these, let's say, the monitoring, and that was here the case. So I don't want to go too much into details. There were these reparations agreements. I also want to highlight on something that came again a generation later. What I didn't expect at the beginning was that the first 10, 15 years were usually for very tactical reasons, the transitional justice. And then only after 20 years, 25 years, you could see that transitional justice had a different let's say, purpose almost. Because again, in the first 10, 15 years, you trial, you compensate. And you can say, the job is done. Let's go home. Let's spend the money on something else. And then you have a generation who says, well, maybe we have some sort of responsibility where we are if we want to be a democratic country, we also want to learn from the past. And this is when these sort of soft measures came into place, like apologies. It's a huge issue now between Korea still and Japan, and there you can see that even 70 years after a war, it still plays a big role because Japan hasn't officially apologized to South Korea for the war crimes and how it can impair diplomatic ties. I want to jump a little bit because I see this is you see a lot of pictures, but it's not relevant here. Another case that is I told about the difference between East and West Germany. What was interesting also to see how Germany, unified Germany, dealt with transitional justice after the reunification in terms of East Germany. And there, sort of the process has been speeded up. But what you can see here with the pictures, 9 November is the day the wall came down, and the civil society, the civic movement of East Germany immediately conquered the KGB or the Stasi at that time and secured the files in order to hold perpetrators accountable, because they were afraid. I mean, if you're potentially a perpetrator of your country, you know there's a regime change, you try to destroy your files. Obviously, it's universal. So they were trying to protect this. So this is when this is how it looks today. This is how it looks in '89, and this is how it looks today, much more organized. And we call this lustration or vetting procedures. The way the Germany does it is quite unique until today, because basically everybody who goes into public service has to be scanned whether he or she has a file. If you were born before '89, you have to have your scan. And I was mentioning yesterday in another talk, I worked at various public institutions in Germany, and every time before I signed the contract, I was scanned because I was obviously born before '89. I could have, even I'm from West Germany, I could potentially be a collaborator of the Stasi. Even if you, as a Brazilian, if you want to work in Germany and you've been born before '89, you will go through the vetting procedure. You will go through these files, because the KGB, of course, was universal in a way, and you just potentially for the point of it. And the point is that they say, look, if you have a file, so far they haven't found any file. For me, I was 20 when the wall came down, so I could potentially collaborate. But if they would find a file on me, then depends on the position that I'm taking in Germany, I could not be taken. I would actually be sued because I was lying, obviously, when I filled out the form. But it depends on the scale. If I was really a top officer in the Stasi, even when you were 18 or 19, you could be, do something really severe. I, for instance, could not run to be president or chancellor of Germany, very high position. So they kind of categorize it, because what they want to avoid is that people who have been collaborating in this instance with a dictatorial regime should not take political leadership in the new regime, because that would weaken the new regime. There's very, it's a prevention. And why am I saying this? Because when you see this vetting and lustration, what it means also for setting up a new regime, particularly a democratic regime, and how important it is, it makes sense to you immediately. And when you think sometimes about it, I'm not sure if you actually think about this, but in Europe we have this big country next door, Russia, and we have a president there who turns into be an autocrat, and he has been a former chief of the KGB. Just imagine, having the former chief of the Secret Service, and it was a really powerful one, the KGB, and now being a president of the country. And of course, with these procedures, you avoid something like this. Under the German laws, he could never even, he would be maybe a car seller today. Yeah, that's usually what the former Stasi officer are. They sell cars and houses and some sort of things. They have good connections. But this is the purpose of it in terms of how it contributes to democracy, trying to avoid that the top guys that had influence in the regime would get into power again. What did I find out about? Let's start with the big elephant here, Spain. Spain I'm not sure. You have to. Maybe you just jump in when I'm beyond everything here. I'm not sure how familiar you are actually with the Spanish case. This is just a brief summary. 1975 actually was one of the last European dictators, let's say, at least Western European dictators. Franco died. We had a similar movement at the same time, actually a year before, in Portugal. But he was actually the only dictator in modern history who died peacefully in bed. We should not forget. And this explains a lot about the transition process in Spain. It's not Portugal, it's not Greece, where you actually had sort of a kind of a revolution or a movement. Yeah. So and then you had, of course, the king coming in and promoting democracy. But we should not underestimate one of the reasons why Spain is always considered this exceptional case is not only because of the way Franco died, but it's also that you had so many old elites still being in place. And when you think about the picture that I just showed you from East Germany in 1989, you had a civil rights movement entering the ministries, basically, entering official space, securing the files because maybe not today, but maybe tomorrow we have a trial against you. That never took place in Spain because of the way the transition went, dying, and then next morning you woke up, the dictator was dead. You didn't even go on the street to protest against him. And therefore, nothing of that sort kind of a transition process in terms of massive reforms or securing files, etc., took place in Spain. So anyway, you had luckily, maybe, I don't know what side you're standing, but some would say luckily the young king said, look, let's try democracy for a change and we'll see if the experiment works. And he brought back the exile community, the Spanish, the Social Democrats, or the Socialists, the Communists, etc. So you had elections. But one of the agreement, El Pacto de Silencio, the Silence Pact, made sure that you, even if you were, member at that time of the Communist or Socialist Party, and even if your grandfather and father disappeared under Franco and you know exactly who was responsible, you made the agreement not to talk about the past. So it's the complete opposite in a way to what you had, let's say, in Germany or in other countries at that time. Absolute silence, because you were not allowed basically to run for office for the Communist Party in Spain in the 1970s if you wanted to speak up. Basically, that was the end of you. Then you had the massive amnesty laws, which are unique in the world. They're even tougher than the Argentinian ones and other ones because they were blanket amnesties. They were absolute amnesty laws that cannot be changed until today. And that is it's a unique case. There is no other country that has them, that basically everybody who did some sort of political issue before 1970, actually 76, they changed the dates there, was free. That was true for everybody who was political active, including 99% of those Franquistas. And that's why you can't touch them today. So, and then, interesting enough, people, after the first shock, after a few years, they said, I would like to put a little memorial here. I think there's a mass grave from Civil War, or this is where Franco did this and this. I want to have a private initiative. And it usually was taken down, or the government kind of kept its silence. And then you had a coup in 1981, and that was sort of an indicator that there was no sort of, a transition to democracy in a natural way by a civil society, civil rights movement, etc., that could push for it. Everything came a little bit by surprise, and it was not really stable. Anyway, they had a change of government in the early 80s, and the government, it was socialist at that time, led, and what they did is they introduced some sort of transitional justice measures, and they are very, very little known. Now I have cited them in the book, but I know there's also some literature in Spanish now coming up reflecting on this, because the government knew at that time to secure social peace and to sort of trust into the governments, because that is the quality of democracy. You have to establish trust. They say let's just go through the back door We cannot have trials. We cannot have truth commissions because that's in the silence pact. It's just forbidden. We can do an indirect transitional justice process by acknowledging people who some way have been victimized and can prove it. For instance, they lost their job, they went to exile because of Franco, whatever. We give them pensions, extra pensions. They get a few, today we say a few euro extras until today. And by this, they acknowledged it, that there actually something went wrong. And if you look at what the purpose of transitional justice, what I said earlier, is it's not only to punish the perpetrator. Of course, it's good if it happens, yeah. But the main purpose is actually to legitimize, to rebuild the trust into the institution, to stabilize the regime. And you have to interact with the people. You have to acknowledge victimhood, to say, look, it wasn't you that was wrong, it was the other side. And this is actually what happened in Spain. Another interesting phenomenon in Spain, and why it's so interesting to study in terms of transitional justice and democracy, is that in Spain, you have, of course, the Basque countries. You have the separatist movement in the Basque country and in Catalonia, but at the early ages, even in other parts. But these are the most known ones. These are the ones, of course, that are now in the news, the Catalans, but also the Basque. And it's interesting that the Basque terrorism, the ETA terrorism, one of the most notorious terror groups in Europe that remained active until very, very recently, that they built up their constituency since 1975. A little bit earlier, they started 10 years earlier, but since 1975, they built up their constituency, their support, on the myth that Franco was still alive. Of course, he was dead, but the people, his shadow was still alive in Madrid. And this mobilized thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in the country to say, look, there was never a regime change in this country. And therefore, we have a right in the Basque country to go against the central government. And basically, the time when actually transitional justice, the movements came, it was a private movement in 2000, and then the historical memory came in 2007, 2008. You can see, it was a civil society movement, but you can see the more there was openness to talk about the past. Yes, trials are still not an issue in Spain, and unfortunately, I believe we will never see any trials. But there were books, there was literature, there were sort of symbolic truth commissions, etc., etc. The moment you opened the box and said, look, let's look what actually happened in the Franco regime, the terrorism declined. And then we had the final ceasefire, which lasts until now, like 3-4 years ago. And it's interesting that there's a correlation. And this is what a lot of TJ supporters say. The more TJ you put into a regime change and the more open you have it, the more likely you have less radical movements in the country, because you have the dialogue about the past. Because one effect of the transitional justice or the dialogue processes that started around 2000, by the way, exactly 25 years after the Franco died, it's another interesting phenomenon. It's always 25 years, something happens. And they went with the literature, with this initiative of this journalist who started to excavate. By the way, the picture here shows excavation of mass graves, and was all voluntarily based. It was civil society based, but the government let it do, and that's the important point. It was some sort of sign of openness. Only since 2005-06 you have open demonstration at the Puerta del Sol, at the central place in Madrid, and where survivors still are looking for the remains of their parents or grandparents that perished mainly during the Civil War or afterwards. But the fact is not so much that this is a surprise. It's more like that they are able to protest. It's only since the last 10-15 years. And there is one thing that I want to show you. You maybe have seen this, Valle de los Caídos. And it's, by the way, it's an interesting thing. This is a huge cross. It's next to Madrid. It's El Escorial. It's just about 50 kilometers from Madrid. It's the largest cross. I know it's a competition to the Brazilians here, actually. I never thought about it. It's because of Rio, very proud of it. But it's the largest freestanding cross in whole Europe, and some would say the whole world. You know, I'm not an expert on it. It's pretty huge, but definitely for Europe. And hardly anybody knows it, and there's a reason for it. This is the graveyard of Franco, by the way. This is his mausoleum. And so actually he's buried there. He's still there, buried, but not, he used to be sort of in a sarcophag, and everybody could see. Now they put him under the earth. However, it took until 2007, because of the civil movements, because about people 25 years after Franco said they were free from fear, and you had sort of an openness to the past, they protest and they said, look, our dictator here is still celebrated. No wonder the Basques are so mad, kind of, yeah. And what they did is they, because the Falange, the Neo-Falange, the Franco supporters, they came here every year to commemorate Franco and the Franco regime. So there was the complete opposite. They were not delegitimizing Franco. They were supporting it. It's interesting that at least one thing that the government, the Spanish government, throughout the whole period, they never promoted this place. It's if you look at any, even at let's say, tourism pamphlet of the 1980s or 90s, you will not see that. Because even so, it's a quite a place. And by the way, it was completed. It used to be a prison camp and concentration camp. Franco, after the Civil War, he imprisoned people there, Republican Spaniards, and they had to build it. And many people died during this time. So it has really a story. Make a long story short, part of this kind of TJ process now of opening a dialogue in Spain, what actually happened is they convert this into a memoria now. But Franco is still there, so if you want to see his grave, there he is. Another last example here is Turkey and Armenia, and that is really a fascinating case for everybody who works in transitional justice. We have, some of you probably familiar, and we're going back to World War I. And even before I started the research, if someone would have told me that Turkey and Armenia, neighboring countries, somewhere in Southeast Europe, you know, somewhere there, have still no diplomatic ties. They have close borders. They're neighbors. Since 110 years, or over 100 years. Well, there was the Soviet Union in between. They didn't have any anyway. But since independence of 1990, Armenia, immediately, they had even a little war there in the Caucasus, no diplomatic tie. And you really think like we're living in the 21st century? Yes, there were atrocities in World War I. And I would also say this was a genocide against the Armenians by the Sultanate. It wasn't even the Turkish Republic. It was a Sultanate at that time, World War I. And they committed severe war crimes, among that a genocide against the Armenian minority. And because Turkey has not atoned with it, had not come to terms with this, has not acknowledged the genocide, let alone the war crimes, Armenia says no open borders. And this is when you hear that story, this is the moment where you think transitional justice has something to do with the way a regime works, doesn't it? I mean, if it didn't matter what happened in the past, if only it's business, then these borders would be open. Yeah? By the way, they do have trade, but they always go via Georgia. You know, they always have to go the other way, not through there's no official border crossing. But when you come to Armenia, they show you where the border crossing used to be 100 years ago, and it's closed. And they're waiting for the day to open it. But both sides do have their share in this game here. It's not only Turkey. So this is, and often what they say, Turkey has a lot of issues, although with a Kurdish minority. I just give you now the Armenian case because it's probably outside Turkey or in this part of the world more known. That when I talk now Cyprus and Kurdistan, etc., it's a big mess. Actually, Turkey has a lot of issues to come to terms with, but this is probably the most known one. No diplomatic ties, and here I could see in the case of Turkey, Turkey had a regime change in 1989. It's very little known that alongside with Eastern Europe, when the communist regime sort of declined and all converted into democracies on paper, Turkey did too. You know, we don't, because Turkey was just like, yeah, Soviet Union, Poland, Ukraine, yes, of course, but Turkey. It's the same time. It was, we could say it was sort of the mood of the time. There were various reasons, but Turkey also abolished the, let's say, the autocratic constitutions they had until then. It was basically a military dictatorship. And had free elections. They applied to become member of the European Union. All wonderful and great. You know, they joined the Council of the European Court for Human Rights. They just went off. So they had massive democratic reforms in the 1990s and around 2000, and probably until 2005. This is the core time. And they did everything right. And part of their tactical movement to democratize was to come to terms with various pasts. And one of this was the Armenian genocide. They didn't call it genocide, they call it massacres, or what's the other term? They have the other terms for this. And they even allowed for sort of public dialogues in 2005, but this one is interesting, but this was about almost 90 years after the genocide. The genocide is, say, to the core genocide in 1915, so this was an anniversary here, 19th anniversary, and it was the first time in the history of Turkey that they actually allowed for like a conference in the university. And they flagged to the world, and it's not a coincidence, in 2005, not only because of the anniversary, there were accession talks with the European Union, and they wanted to show, look, we're a democratic country, we have no problems with our past, and civil society can do what they want. Turkey is a case for these tactical concessions they made to the outside world, but also to the inside world, to say, we use transitional justice tools in this way, public dialogues, because we couldn't have trials, obviously, on this case, because the people were all dead. But we also do some sort of reconciliation. This is an absolutely fascinating incident. This is a memorial, well, it's in the city of Kars. Kars is close to the Armenian border. It was a former Armenian city. It was completely devastated in World War I. Has never been rebuilt, but it's for the Armenians, it's a symbol, and nobody lives there anymore. It's an empty space. Turkey, Mr. Erdogan himself. It was around 2008, 2009, said, because I want the world to love me, I make a concession with the Armenians, and I build a memorial for reconciliation, Armenians, Turks, at Kars. And he asked a Turkish artist to design a memorial. And so this symbols Armenians and Turks, etc. And you can see this hand here, actually this memorial, and you can see some of the rubble there. It was destroyed again by the government. So it was built first, and then you could say this autocratic leader Erdogan, he used a TJ measure, let's say, to win sympathies and to win trust, etc. But it wasn't really for moral responsibility or he really wanted to engage civil society. And because the Armenians didn't react the way he wanted, but kind of supporting also the Turkish cause, maybe to become member of the European Union, etc., he then decided that the memorial was not adequate from an even ethical point of view, and they destroyed it, and they just destroyed other. It does no longer exist. This is a picture. It does no longer exist. The memorial simply does not exist. So I'm just telling you here, I'm a bit out of the context. There's 400 pages, and I think I've talked already long enough to say how transitional justice measures, even if they are obviously not applied, but maybe through the back door, how they can contribute. But if you don't apply them full-fledged, how they can actually impair sort of a democratic development. And if they only are applied, like say, for tactical reasons or in an exclusive manner, they more or less are aimed to serve as an autocratic regime. And I just look at the watch and I said, I've talked far too long. You should have just interrupted me. I'm sorry. But you have been quite attentive, even so it's late. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to discuss with you whatever you want to. Thank you. If you work 10 years on a subject, you can talk forever. So let's see.
Okay, so thank you very much for your talk and for the introduction of the book and the main contents. So the floor is open for questions, and it must not necessarily be questions on either Germany, Spain, or Turkey, but can be on the more general questions related to democratization and transitional justice, obviously. Because as I've seen, like the first 100 pages of the book are more actually conceptual, theoretical, rather than going into the cases. That's only the following pages then.
Right. The case is just to illustrate. It could be Brazil, it could be any country. Yeah.
Yes, I'm answering.
This second phase, I'm seeing case as Turkey. It seems that democracy come out,
Yeah.
and then you see a backlash. Brazil is a case similarly. What about the second phase of transition? First phase post-transition regime, and then the second phase. Are you following this?
Yes. One of the reasons why I took these cases was because I could see in all these cases a long-term process. It wasn't like, oh, they have a transition. 5 years later, I go in and I say, whoops, there's no democracy. That would not be fair, obviously. So I wanted to look at countries who have at least 20 or 30 years of transition or transformation, because only then you see the correlation, let alone the spiral correlation between transitional justice and the political regime. And this is what you call the second phase, basically. This is the first phase, and it's a tactical, it's even a technical phase where you introduce measures. You often do them half-hearted. You just say, oh, like Erdogan did, he introduced them, but actually I want the European Union to continue their accession talks. If they want me to do this, to reconcile with the Armenians, all right, I do it, as long as I benefit. And this is what you have in the first phase. The second phase is actually, once you empower sort of victim groups, I didn't talk about that phenomenon too, but I could find it also in the Spanish case, and the German and the Turkish phase. Sort of a side effect of the first phase is when you install some sort of low-level memorials or commission, whatever you do, it encourages particular victim groups to participate and to claim, oh, we want a bigger memorial, we want a truth commission, we want a history commission. And that is another side effect. It triggers civil society engagement. Again, don't think in a linear way, think in a spiral way. But the fact that you have victims groups that you acknowledge, and you do not put them automatically in prison, that's what you do in a more dictatorial environment, encourage other civil society movements too. And you know democracy can only live with civil society. So it's an interesting phenomenon. I could not see this side effect between victim groups and civil society in the first 5 or 10 years. It always starts much later, and in some cases much later. But they are the contribution to democracy.